Well, it's Monday and we're wrapping up 1 Corinthians. We're going to finish chapter 16, verses 12 to the end of the letter. And Paul finishes this letter with a series of admonitions and greetings. And they're all very purposeful because they tie back into what he's talked about already in the letter. In fact, he brings Apollos up. And Apollos was one of the very first people he brought up in this letter because there were factions there in Corinth, some saying, I am of Apollos. And interestingly, he says in verse 12, now concerning, it's the same phrase in Greek, now concerning Apollos. So maybe they had actually written to him in their letter asking about Apollos, seeing how he's doing, seeing when he's going to come back and visit them. Remember, they had a relationship with Apollos because at the end of chapter 18 of Acts, after Aquila and Priscilla showed Apollos the more accurate way, Apollos went over to Corinth. And then Paul, he parted ways and went to Ephesus. And Paul was in Ephesus for a while. Now, we don't really know how long Apollos was in Corinth, but eventually he leaves Corinth, he goes over to Ephesus to be where Paul is, and now Paul is actually urging Apollos saying, hey, when are you going to go over to visit the Corinthians? I think that you should go and see them, but Apollos said the timing is just not right. Maybe because he's in Ephesus with Paul, he has the same mentality Paul does, that look, there's a wide door of service opened in Ephesus here, that there's a great opportunity for me to stay here, so the timing is not right to go back. It may also be that Apollos is a little hesitant to return to Corinth because of the faction that had attached themselves to him. He may want to kind of give that time and give Paul's rebuke in this letter time to sort of settle in so that faction will go away before Apollos actually goes back to visit. Verse 13, be on the alert, stand firm in the faith, act like men, be strong. He's using military language. He's telling them to get in the fight, to wake up and to realize that you are fighting against Satan and his evil forces. And you can't just sit around and be not paying attention to the way that Satan is trying to infiltrate the church. And that's what they've been doing. That's why the church has just been so disrupted and turned upside down by the Greco-Roman philosophy around them, because they're not paying attention to the way Satan is working and infiltrating not just the church, but infiltrating their thinking and infiltrating their hearts and turning them to be selfish against their brethren. They need to really act like men, he says, which is not just a military figure, but it's also a dig and a jab at their maturity level. Remember how many times in the letter he's told them, stop acting like children. You need to be like men. You need to grow up and be like adults and get in this fight and take this fight seriously against Satan, because honestly, they are losing this fight. They are being terrible soldiers, allowing the enemy to just totally wreak havoc on their church. Now in verse 14, Paul summarizes the message of this letter when he says, let all that you do be done in love. Remember, we said the main message of 1 Corinthians is that love solves all church problems. They have so many problems, and all of their problems are caused either by a lack of love for God or a lack of love for their brethren, or both. Think about how love would solve all of the issues that they're facing. Love would solve the problem of factions and divisions and arrogance against one another. It would solve this idea that they've got a man living in sin and they don't love him enough to confront him about it. It would solve their selfishness in taking each other to court. It would solve the problem of divorcing their spouses. It would solve the problem of going to idols' temple to eat meat, even though it's destroying the souls of their brethren. It would cause them to stop taking the Lord's Supper in such a way that the rich people get there before all the poor people and eat all the food, so that the poor have none. It will solve all their foolish, petty competition over who has the better spiritual gift. Love solves all of their church problems, which is why Paul included that grand chapter back in chapter 13, detailing exactly what love looks like, urging the Corinthians to love like God loves. Verse 15, he brings up Stephanas. Now, we don't know a whole lot about him. He mentioned Stephanas earlier in chapter 1 about being one of the only ones that he remembers baptizing, but he was one of the first converts in Achaia. But I think he's bringing him up, again, purposefully, because Paul in this letter is all about urging the Corinthians to imitate other people who are righteous, to imitate him, for instance, and to imitate Jesus. Well, here he's bringing Stephanas up because, though we don't know all the details about this, here's a man who is giving his life for the service of the saints, for the help and aid of his brethren. And those are the people that Paul wants them to look up to, because they have such a problem loving their brethren. They have such a problem making sacrifices for the sake of their brethren. But Stephanas, he's a great example of the Corinthians and how they should actually be living. And so he says, hold this guy in high esteem, learn from him, subject yourself to him and his example. He also brings up two others, Fortunatus and Achaicus, which we don't really know much about, but presumably these three men actually brought the letter that they wrote to Paul over to Ephesus. Maybe they even brought an additional oral report about what was going on there. These are probably separate people from Chloe's household, where Paul mentioned in chapter 1 he had heard the initial report about the Corinthians, but maybe these three guys kind of confirmed what Chloe's household said and maybe gave Paul a little bit more detail. But I love what Paul says here, that they supplied what was lacking on your part. And he doesn't mean financially, because again, he's not really seeking financial support from the Corinthians. He's talking about emotionally. He misses his Corinthian brethren. As much as he's written to them in challenging ways and rebuked them in this letter, he still loves them. Earlier he said in chapter 4, he is their father. They are his spiritual children. And so he misses the brethren. But when these three Corinthian brethren came to visit Paul, wow, it just filled his heart, because it provided that emotional connection with the Corinthians that he had been missing from being apart from them. It says his spirit was refreshed. And eventually these men are going to refresh the Corinthian spirit by bringing greetings back from Paul and even bringing this letter, even though this letter's not going to be received very well because it's going to be hard to hear. But they'll know Paul still cares about us. Paul still loves us. He's still corresponding with us by this letter. Verse 19, the churches of Asia greet you. When Paul was in Ephesus, he would also go to other churches in that area. Ephesus was located in Asia, so he would go to other churches in that area as well. And he's saying all those churches are greeting you because we're all one. And I love that, because remember, the Corinthians many times were acting like they were the only church. You know, they could do whatever they wanted. They were special. And Paul kept trying to tell them all throughout this letter, no, you're not an island off to yourself. You're a part of a larger body of Christ. And so be like these other churches. Don't practice stuff that none of the other churches are practicing. And here he's bringing up that unity again, but this time in a more positive way, and saying, hey, all these churches that are a part of the body, that you're a part of, they're greeting you. They love you too. They're sending you their love and their greetings as well. Aquila and Priscilla, he mentions, which they knew about, because remember back in chapter 18 of Acts, Aquila and Priscilla were living in Corinth for a while. That's actually where Paul met them. But then eventually they moved to Ephesus as well, and they are hosting a church in their house, and they also send their greetings because they know the Corinthians. All the brethren are greeting them. He says to greet one another with a holy kiss. In the first century world, kissing each other on the cheek was a common greeting, and Paul's main concern is that when they greet one another, that kiss needs to be holy. It needs to be a kiss that's coming from sincere love for each other, from a desire to be united as one, not to be divided against each other, not coming from arrogance or a deceitful kiss, kind of like Judas when he went and kissed Jesus in the garden. That was an unholy, deceitful kiss. Paul wants them to be truly loving one another and unified, and to represent that in the way that they greet one another. Verse 21, he writes the greeting in his own hand at the end. In the first century, again, letters were usually dictated orally, and then they were written down by a secretary or an amanuensis, which was a fancy term. But Paul wants to make sure they know this letter is authentic. It's really coming from him, because there are going to be a lot of fake letters circulating in the first century world, even claiming to be from Paul. Paul wants to make sure, no, you know this is from me. This is legitimate. He says, if anyone does not love the Lord, there's our love again. Jesus said the greatest command is to love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and mind. If you don't love the Lord, you're going to be accursed. And then he uses this Aramaic term, Maranatha, which means come, O Lord. He's inviting Jesus to come back so that all of those amazing things in chapter 15 can take place, where death will be defeated. All things will be placed under Jesus' feet. We'll be resurrected to live with him in these imperishable bodies for all eternity. That's what Paul longs for. And he wants the Corinthians to long for that as well. And not just to long for it, but to be ready for it by changing and fixing the problems in the congregation and loving the Lord like they should. He wishes grace upon them and favor, and then he closes with his own love. Again, this is all about love. Even though Paul writes some really hard things in this letter, he wants them to know it's all coming from a place of love. A couple applications as we close. First of all, again, let's apply this to ourselves. If there are problems in the church, if we're struggling in our relationships with our brethren, it's because we don't love God enough and we don't love our brethren enough. Maybe we're just being selfish and arrogant and prideful. We are refusing to sacrifice and to be humble servants for our brethren the way Jesus was a humble servant for us. If we will humble ourselves, become a servant in love, that will fix all of the problems in the congregation. And finally, we need to love our brethren enough to be honest with each other when we're not living right. That's what Paul does for the Corinthians with this letter. He writes some things that are going to be very hard for them to hear, but it's what they need to hear because he loves them. Love doesn't mean we're just nice to everyone and we never say anything that could upset anybody or hurt anybody's feelings. No, love is honest when there's a problem. That's what Paul does for his brethren, and that's the power of this letter, to help them solve those problems. Love solves all church problems. That's 1 Corinthians. I'll see you tomorrow. Well, we're back in Acts 19 for a few days with Paul in Ephesus as he finishes up the last year or so of his mission there in Ephesus. Remember, he wrote 1 Corinthians from this city, and he told them, I'm not ready to come to you yet. There's still work to be done in Ephesus. God has opened a door for me. And so in the next few days of our Bible reading plan, we're going to be here with Paul in Acts 19, finishing out his time there in Ephesus. Remember, the last time we were in Acts 19 was verse 10, where it said he had spent 2 years there. That's probably the time toward the end of that 2-year period that he wrote 1 Corinthians around 55 AD, telling them, look, there's still work to do in Ephesus. And we're picking up today in verse 11. And what we'll see in this section from 11 to 20 is the heart of Ephesus, because Ephesus was world-renowned for its obsession with magic. They were very into magical spells and incantations to ward off evil spirits and to bring good blessings upon their lives and to manipulate, really, the gods into doing their bidding. And they had entire books just filled with magic spells. And they would take these magic spells and they would write them on amulets, little pieces of jewelry that they would bring around with them that they'd wear as sort of lucky rabbit's foot almost to again ward off evil and harm and just bring the protection of the gods into their life. I find it fascinating that it's in the midst of this culture that God starts by showing us that Paul was performing, Luke says, extraordinary miracles. Now that sounds very strange because miracles by definition are extraordinary, but Luke's saying these are extra special miracles. Maybe in a couple senses. First of all, usually the person who performs the miracle needs to be present with the person that they're helping. You know, the person that they're helping needs to be like, in the same room as the person performing the miracle, or at least within eyesight of the person doing the miracle. But these people aren't even next to Paul. They're actually somewhere else. And people are taking Paul's clothing items, his handkerchiefs, his aprons, and bringing him to these people in totally different locations, and they're being healed. And again, normally when a person heals somebody, the second thing that makes this extraordinary is normally a person might touch them or might say something to them in person, but this healing is actually taking place through objects, through these clothing items. And I wonder if what God is doing with these extraordinary miracles is he's kind of adapting to their culture in some way and making Paul's clothing like amulets. They would have those amulets, those physical objects that they would wear and believe that it would bring protection and healing and warding off spirits. But Paul's clothing is sort of acting like an amulet, but it's doing so in a far superior way to the actual amulets that they were using. It's showing that Jesus' power is so much greater than the demonic power that these people are tapping into with their magic spells. When I say magic, I don't mean that they were just card tricks or sleight of hand or smoke and mirrors, those kind of things. No, they were actually tapping into the demonic realm, and these things did have power of some kind, but that power was coming from the demonic world, which God had always forbid in his law. Even back in Deuteronomy 18 to the Jews, he told them, don't be messing around with witchcraft and sorcery and omens and divination and spells. Don't be doing any of that stuff because the demonic realm is very real. And humans throughout history have been able to tap into those demonic powers, and Jesus' power is far superior. And that's really what this section is about, showing that Jesus' power is true power compared to all these false counterfeit power sources. And another way that that's exposed is when these 7 sons of Sceva, they try to use Jesus' name to cast out demons from a man. And they're using the name of the Lord, which this was very common. They would take the name of a deity or a god or some sort of power, and they believed just the citation of their name was like a magical incantation to call upon that god or spiritual power to do their will and to do their bidding. They're trying to use Jesus like that. And that doesn't work at all. The demons just laugh at them and say to the 7 sons of Sceva, which we don't really know who Sceva was, but anyway, they laugh and say, we know who Jesus is, and we know who Paul is, but who in the world are you? And they jump on them and overpower them, and they flee out naked, and everybody in the town sees this, and it just leads them to repent and to realize, wow, we got to get rid of these false power sources, and we need to come to Jesus for His power. And so they come in verse 18, confessing their sins. Interestingly, it says they disclosed their practices, which is amazing because they believed part of the power of their magical spells was in their secrecy, and that nobody else knew them. And so the fact that they're disclosing their practices seems like they were actually making their secrets public and just publicly confessing, these are all of the secret spells that I've been falsely trusting in, and I'm done with all that lifestyle, and I'm coming to Jesus. And they actually burn their books, and it gives the amount of the price of what they burned. It says 50,000 pieces of silver. That was going to be 50,000 days' wages worth of books, which is 136 years worth of wages. That is a ton of money, and they're just burning it all because they recognize how worthless this is compared to the power of Jesus. And that's why verse 20 we get, remember, Luke gives 6 of these progress reports all throughout the book of Acts. We get a progress report here that the word of the Lord is growing mightily and prevailing, because, again, the gospel is touching hearts. Jesus' power is shown to be superior to the false powers of the demonic realm, and people are coming to Him with an amazing financially sacrificial display of repentance. Now, I want to include verses 21 and 22 in today's reading while 1 Corinthians 16 is still fresh on our minds, because Paul's travel plans that he communicated to them there in chapter 16 of 1 Corinthians matches up very well with what happens here and what it says here, with one difference, and I'll show you that. Verse 21, now after these things were finished, Paul purposed in the Spirit to go to Jerusalem after he had passed through Macedonia and Achaia. Remember, Corinth was located in Achaia, saying, after I have been there, I must also see Rome. So this matches up perfectly with what he told the Corinthians, because he said, look, I'm going to stay in Ephesus, but then once I leave Ephesus, I'm going to go up through Macedonia and then down south to Achaia and to Corinth. And then the difference is, he wasn't sure after Corinth whether he was going to go to Jerusalem or not. He wasn't sure. He said, look, if I go to Jerusalem, then you guys can send some brethren with me to take that financial contribution to the needy saints in Jerusalem. But if I don't go and the timing's not right, well, then you all can send your own brethren with the financial contribution. I'll send letters of recommendation ahead of them. But now it seems like Paul is more sure. This is the difference. And this is why, again, we think that Paul wrote 1 Corinthians before this verse right here, because in 1 Corinthians 16, he wasn't sure if he was going to go to Jerusalem or not after Corinth, but now he's sure. He's made up his mind, I'm going to take that financial contribution to the needy saints in Jerusalem after I visit Macedonia and after I visit Corinth. Now, notice what else he says in verse 22, having sent into Macedonia 2 of those who ministered to him, Timothy and Erastus, he himself stayed in Asia for a while. Now this also matches up perfectly with 1 Corinthians, because remember, he told the Corinthians he sent Timothy to them to expect Timothy's arrival. But this shows us the specific route Paul sent Timothy on. That yes, he sent Timothy to Corinth, but first he wanted Timothy to go up through Macedonia and then to come down to Corinth, which makes perfect sense again because Paul expected the letter of 1 Corinthians to arrive before Timothy got there. Why? Because Paul's in Ephesus. He probably sent that letter of 1 Corinthians by the hand of Fortunatus and Stephanus and Achaicus those men that he mentioned at the end of chapter 16 straight across the sea, straight across from Ephesus to Corinth, whereas Timothy took a more roundabout way to go up through Macedonia and then eventually come to Corinth at some point after the arrival of that letter. Now, Paul, again, he says, I wanted to stay in Ephesus for a while. I wanted to wait until the day of Pentecost. And that's what we're seeing here, that he's staying in Asia for a while. Exactly what he told them at the end of that letter. And let me finish with an application drawn from the Ephesians' willingness to burn those magic books, even though it costs them so much. We need to look in our own lives and be honest about what needs to be burned, what needs to be eradicated, either literally or metaphorically. Because sometimes we repent, but then we leave remnants of our old life still around us that gives us easy access to going back to that sin. And I appreciate their willingness to say, look, we can't be around these magic books. We can't sell these books to others because it's going to lead other people to sin. They just need to be completely destroyed. And there may be some things like that for us. There may be physical objects around us, like, hey, maybe I'm keeping alcohol in the house and I've convinced myself that, drinking in moderation is okay, but it's just been so destructive to my life. I need to just dump that down the sink. I need to throw that away completely. Or maybe there's a phone that I have or a computer that is unfiltered with its internet access, so I can just go to sites that I shouldn't be going to, and it's just a constant draw for me. And so I need to get a filter installed on my computer, just destroy my access, burn my access altogether to those kinds of things. Maybe there's people in my life, and I'm not telling you to set people on fire, okay? But we might have to cut ties with old friends that keep pulling us back into old sinful habits. Remember, Jesus said to be radical, to be willing to cut off your right hand and cut out your eye if it's causing you to stumble, no matter how costly it is. We need to just get rid of the things that will continue to hold us back in our Christian life. Sometimes we wonder, why can't I make progress as a Christian? Why aren't I growing? It's because we've got all these things, these weights that are hindering us and sucking us back in to the life that we're trying to leave behind. So set it on fire so that it's not even an option anymore, so that you can move forward in faith and show Jesus. He is the true power in your life. When we submit to these other sins, we're basically saying what the Ephesians used to say about their magical spells, and that was, these things have the true power to help my life and to bring healing and good fortune and salvation. That's what we're doing when we turn to sin. We're saying this sin is what has the true power to save me. But when we set those things on fire and we say we're done with that forever, we're proclaiming boldly that Jesus is the only one with the true power to save, and I'm submitting my life to His power and letting His power change me forever. Hope that's helpful. I'll see you tomorrow. We're continuing with Paul in Ephesus today in Acts 19, verses 21 to 31. And remember, yesterday I showed you how verses 21 and 22 match up perfectly with what Paul shared about his travel plans to the Corinthians in 1 Corinthians 16. But I want to point out something else very important about verse 21, and that is Paul's determination to go to Rome. He says, I must also see Rome. And it also says he determined this by the Spirit, or in the Spirit. This is probably the idea that the Holy Spirit is giving Paul guidance here, that this is where he needs to go. And here's why this is so important, because remember I said a long time ago when we started Acts, the book of Acts is really volume 2 of Luke's Gospel. In Luke's Gospel, Luke is all about Jesus' work on the earth while he was here on the earth in the flesh. But Acts is all about Jesus' continued work on the earth from heaven. And Jesus now in the book of Acts is working on the earth through the acts of his apostles. So many times the lives of the apostles will actually be mirror reflections of Jesus' life. And this is another example of that, because in Luke chapter 9 and verse 51, it says that Jesus set his face to go to Jerusalem. And after that verse, Luke's gospel is showing us how Jesus then makes that journey to Jerusalem to his ultimate destiny of dying for the sins of the world. Well, here, Luke is showing us this is Paul's destiny. His destiny is to go to Rome and to preach the gospel in the heart of the empire. That is Paul's destiny, but interestingly, he's not going to go to Rome in the way that he expects. He will go to Rome in the order that he expects. He expects to go to Macedonia first, and then to Achaia, visit Corinth, like we talked about yesterday, then to Jerusalem, taking that financial collection to the needy saints in Jerusalem, and then to go to Rome. So he expects to go there in that order, and that will be the order in which he goes, but he doesn't expect that he's going to go there as a prisoner. he is going to go to Rome at the end of Acts, but he's going to be taken captive and brought to be a prisoner in Rome. So it's kind of like Jesus. Many people expected Jesus to go to Jerusalem as a king, as this victorious warrior, but he ends up going to Jerusalem and is treated like a criminal and is put to death. So Paul's life here is going to be paralleling Jesus' life. His journey to Rome is going to be this destiny by God to bring the gospel to the heart of the empire so that Christianity will spread in a way that it never had before. So just keep that in mind as we continue through Acts, tracing Paul's journey to Rome. Well, now we've got a riot on our hands in Ephesus, and it's important to know Ephesus was home to the Temple of Artemis, which has been deemed one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. This thing was massive. I'll put a picture up of an artistic rendering of what it may have looked like based on all the descriptions we have from early writings. This thing was huge, and it was just a marvel of architectural engineering and genius in its design. The thing was 350 feet long, 180 feet wide, 60 feet tall, and it had 117 massive marble pillars. And the thing was just filled with all sorts of artwork and lined with gold and paintings and sculptures. The base upon which the temple sat was almost taller than the temple itself. It was such a huge structure, and it was a tourist attraction. And people would come from all over to see this temple and to worship Artemis there. And in fact, it's possible that the occasion for what we're reading in Acts 19 was Artemisian, which was a regular yearly feast held in honor of Artemis. We don't know for sure that that was the occasion here, but they did have yearly feasts where people would make pilgrimages to come and visit the temple of Artemis. And Demetrius is a silversmith, and he's furious about Paul preaching the gospel because he's taken business away from him, because his job was to build little silver figurines of the temple of Artemis, or maybe of Artemis herself. Artemis was a goddess of fertility who would bring fertility on your land and in your own family to bear more children. And as these tourists came and bought these silver figurines, these little idols of Artemis and her temple, they brought them back home with them. Well, then they could have that same fertility and good fortune and protection back home. And so no wonder Demetrius is angry about this. He's not only losing money, but he knows if Artemis, people aren't worshiping her like they're supposed to, well then they may not have the fertility of their crops and all the good blessings brought about by Artemis, which is so typical of false religion, that it's really all about them. It's not like, oh, well, we just really love Artemis so much. It's all about what Artemis can do for them, the money that they can make by selling these images of Artemis, and the fertility that they can have on their land by staying on Artemis's good side. It's really all self-serving, and Demetrius is furious that the gospel is changing people's hearts and convincing them that there's only one true God, and all these other gods are false. So he gathers other tradesmen who are in a similar trade, making figurines to the gods and selling them to people. And he says, look, this is a threat to our business. We got to run these guys out of town. And I love what he says. Paul convinces people of in verse 26. Paul's saying that gods made with hands are no gods at all. Now, he doesn't appreciate the irony of what he's saying there. What he means is that the gods that we're using our hands to craft into figurines, Paul's saying those gods are false. But he doesn't appreciate the irony of what's going on here, that actually what Paul is saying is not just that the figurines you're making are handcrafted, but that the gods themselves are handcrafted, that you actually made up those gods. They are made up by human beings. They're not true gods at all. And Demetrius is also furious, and this is another evidence that it's a man-made god. He's concerned in verse 27 that Artemis will be dethroned from her magnificence if people do not worship her. That's a huge difference between the one true God and Artemis. That Artemis only has power if human beings give her power. That she can actually lose her power and be dethroned from her greatness if human beings refuse to worship her. That's not the way it is with the one true God. The one true God is magnificent and glorious no matter who recognizes it. Even if nobody worships him as such, he still maintains his magnificence. Nobody can dethrone the one true God. Well, this is a convincing argument, so The mob, they're filled with rage. They're angry. They start shouting, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." They grab some of Paul's traveling companions and bring them into the theater. The theater, we also have some pictures of that. It still actually remains today. It's about 25,000 people could fit in this theater, and they would use it for entertainment purposes. They would use it sometimes for city council meetings and maybe trials. And so who knows what they're going to do with Paul's companions here. Maybe they're going to beat them or threaten them or kick them out. Paul thinks he can go down there and reason with them, though. But his disciples will not let him go. And not only that, but the Asiarchs will not let him go. Asiarchs were like liaisons between Asia and Rome. And they were in charge of organizing festivals for the honor of Roman emperors. So they were meant to basically foster Roman patriotism there in Asia. And remember, one of Luke's points is that the gospel is not a threat to Rome. It's not a military threat to Rome. And so he includes this fact that the Asiarchs were actually friends of Paul. Again, showing that the gospel and Rome are not enemies. And for a long time, critics of the Bible used to accuse Luke of being historically inaccurate for mentioning Asiarchs here, because they said there were no Asiarchs in the first century. They didn't come on the scene till hundreds of years later. So Luke must have written Acts way later than the first century. That is until we found inscriptions dating back to the first century that mentioned Asiarchs, validating Luke's historical claims here. And this happens all the time with the Bible, that the Bible will make some historical claim. Critics will say, no way, that's impossible, the Bible got it wrong. But then given enough time, we always find discoveries in archaeology that validate what the Bible says. Of course, those discoveries never make the front page of the news. Those things are always swept away. Now, the critics criticizing the Bible, that'll make the front page, but then we just ignore it, and it's just a little bit awkward, when we find these details validating Scripture. But that's so encouraging to my faith. I hope it's encouraging to yours as well. Let me give you a couple practical applications as we close. First of all, there is no God like Yahweh. He is the one true God. All other gods are made with human hands. Human beings invent these gods for their own benefit, to allow them to do what they want to do, or for some perceived self-interest. But no human being made the one true God with their hands. God made us with His, and He is magnificent, whether we recognize His magnificence or not. And the Bible's message is, one day you will. We all will recognize His magnificence, whether in this life or on the day of judgment. Every knee will bow. And the point is, you better recognize His magnificence right now in this life before it's too late, because all these false gods that we're serving, they will come to nothing. In fact, here's a picture of the ruins now. All that remains left of the temple of Artemis, destroyed in 263 AD by the Goths. Destroyed, just like every other false god invented by human beings which fade away. The one true God is eternal. Recognize His magnificence, bow down to Him now. The second application is, sometimes people cannot be reasoned with. Paul thinks he can go down and reason with this mob, but this is not going to be a good situation. They're not going to be able to reason. They're just probably going to try to kill Paul if he goes down there. And it's okay for Christians to not purposely put ourselves in a position of becoming a martyr. If we know this isn't really wise to go down here because these people don't want to talk, they just want to kill me, or they just want to shout and scream and yell, and they have no interest in the gospel that I'm trying to present to them, you don't have to go there. Jesus is okay with us avoiding situations that are just not wise to needlessly put ourselves in harm's way. That's what Paul does here. Sometimes we got to do that as well. If you got a friend or a coworker who every single time you try to talk to them about Jesus, they just shout you down and they insult you and they make fun of you, it's okay to not cast your pearls before swine. It's okay to just avoid that situation and say, they're not interested. I don't need to go in there and become a punching bag just for no reason and let them treat Jesus like a punching bag. That's not good. Jesus is magnificent and they are not recognizing it. But just because they don't recognize it, it doesn't dethrone Jesus. One day they will bow their knee before Him and recognize His magnificence and answer for it on the day of judgment. Hope that's helpful. I'll see you tomorrow. Today we're in Acts 19, verse 32, on into chapter 20 and verse 2. And remember, there's an angry mob now in Ephesus. They're angry because Paul is convincing people not to buy these images of Artemis, and so the silversmiths are losing money, so they're leading a procession, a mob down the street chanting, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians," and Paul wanted to go reason with them. His companions wouldn't let him, and it's a good thing because these people were not open to reason. In fact, it says in verse 32, many of them don't even know why they're there. It's like they just saw this procession of people shouting down the streets and they just joined in, not knowing what they were actually joining in on. Maybe there was some town meeting going on. Maybe there was just some period of worship to Artemis and they're just jumping in, even though they have no idea why they are even there. And then a man named Alexander, a Jew, we don't know exactly what he said, but probably he was trying to distance himself and his fellow Jews from Christians. Many people confused Christianity and Judaism in the first century. And so Alexander's probably trying to tell the crowd, look, you guys should be angry at Paul and the Christians, but don't be angry at us Jews. We're not the ones causing problems. But the Ephesians, they don't care. They're not there to listen to reason. They definitely don't care about the Jews. This Gentile city doesn't really care about Jews. They're going to look down on the Jews as inferior. So they just shout right over Alexander. They don't even let him finish. They just start shouting again, great is Artemis of the Ephesians. For 2 hours they do this. These people are not open to reason. They can't refute any of the arguments Paul made. All they can do is shout. And that's so often the way it is with opponents of Christianity, or really opponents of truth in general. If you don't have an argument, hey, just be louder than your opponent. Just shout them down. That's what they're doing here in this meeting. Well, the town clerk comes, and he's like the chief administrative officer of the city, in charge of, managing town meetings and keeping things orderly and recording decisions made at these meetings. And he's also the liaison between them and the Roman government. And he knows that if the Romans find out about this mob, they're going to be furious. Rome does not like mobs or riots because that leads to revolution. That causes all kinds of problems, people not paying their taxes. And so Rome's chief concern was order in the provinces. And if they got accused of starting this riot and being unruly, they would be hit with fines by Rome. And the leader of the mob might actually be executed. So Demetrius might actually be executed. It's just so ironic that they're forming this mob because they're worried about how much Christianity is going to cost them financially. But if they keep this up, it's going to cost them even more when Rome penalizes them with fees. And so the town clerk, he puts a stop to all of this. He's got a lot of power in that city. And so he does have the people's ear. And he makes 4 basic arguments. First of all, Christianity is not going to steal Artemis's glory. Everybody knows that Artemis is magnificent and Ephesus is the city of Artemis, and nobody's going to change that. And he mentions this image that fell from heaven, probably just referring to some legend that this is where Artemis came from. She fell down from the skies like a meteorite, basically. And so that's the image that they have set up in the temple, came from the skies. Well, he says, based on that fact, you guys are acting irrationally. You're acting more emotionally than logically. Secondly, he says the men that you've brought here, Paul's travel companions, they're innocent. They haven't been robbing temples. They haven't been blaspheming our goddess. Thirdly, he says you guys have the right way to go about doing this. If you have a genuine problem with Paul and his travel companions, there's a way to handle that, and that is to bring your case to the courts, to hold a town meeting, to present it to the Roman proconsuls if need be. But this is not the right way to handle this. And fourthly, this is putting us in danger with the Romans. We're not going to be able to explain to them and give them a good reason for why we formed this riot, and they are not going to be happy about it. And so upon this 4th argument, everybody was convinced, and they said, okay, yep, let's go. They disband. He dismisses the assembly. And once again, Christianity is validated in the eyes of Rome. This is, again, what Luke is trying to do, is show Christianity is not a threat to Rome. Paul is not going around telling people to lead an insurrection and to form riots and to overthrow the Roman government. That's not happening at all. In fact, you have a town clerk, again, a liaison between them and Rome, who is siding with Paul and saying that they're innocent, he and his travel companions. You had the Asiarchs, also liaisons with the Romans, saying that they were friends with Paul. You had earlier in chapter 18, when Paul first came to Corinth, you had the proconsul Gallio not really be able to accuse Paul or his companions of anything worthy of punishment or guilt. So again, this is Luke accomplishing his purpose of showing Christianity is not a threat to the empire. If Christianity were a threat to the empire, it would not work so well for Christians. I mean, God certainly could protect them and destroy the Romans and all that, but that's not really God's purpose for Christianity. And so if Rome got wind that Christianity was a threat to them, well, then they'd go to war and they'd bring swords and they'd just kill all the Christians. And that wouldn't work at all in God's plan, okay? Because then the gospel wouldn't be able to spread because all the Christians would have died. So this is so important to make this apologetic, this defense for Christianity. That's what Luke is doing in Acts. Now, another application here I want to make before we move on to chapter 20, because we're going to get into some technical stuff there that's going to tie into where we're going, is don't just blindly follow mobs. Don't just blindly follow the crowds. And it may not be crowds literally making a procession down the streets, but we have crowds on social media. Okay, we have crowds in the news. We have majority opinions about things that can be tempting to just get sucked into without really thinking it through. And we might end up joining some group who stands for something, and we don't even know why we're there. We're confused about why we're even joining in with this group because we don't really understand what's going on or why they believe what they believe, but we're just kind of jumping on the bandwagon as Christians. That's a terrible thing. We have to be thinking critically, especially because sometimes in our modern world, jumping on the bandwagon can lead to the condemnation of the innocent. You might have the news who takes this mainstream view about somebody's guilt in a court case, when in reality that person's not guilty at all. We've just basically formed a mob and claimed that he is guilty and that he deserves punishment, and everybody just kind of jumps on because that's the popular view, when in reality that may not be the case at all. We have to be very careful not to get sucked in to the mobs around us and stay objective. Don't be rash, don't be emotional. That's really what this was all about. They were just being emotional. They were not being rational at all. Well, now we get into chapter 20, and these two opening verses are critical for where we're going with our daily Bible reading plan over the next few months, and also critical for where we're going tomorrow when we start the letter of 2 Corinthians. I'll show you how. In verse 1, he leaves Ephesus and he goes to Macedonia. And you can see on a map, he's going up north into Macedonia, and it's going to be from there in Macedonia that he's going to write the letter of 2 Corinthians, probably around 56 AD. Now, if you take the late date of the letter of Galatians, he's also going to be writing the letter of Galatians from Macedonia as well, again around the same time, probably 56 AD. Well, then he continues in verse 2, when he had gone through those districts and had given them much exhortation, he came to Greece. That is where Corinth is located. So there he's finally coming to see the Corinthians, which is what he was telling them in his letters was his plan to do. Well, he comes to Corinth, and then it's going to be from Corinth that he's going to write the letter to the Romans. And Romans will be written around 57 AD. So that's why in our daily Bible reading plan, we're going to read 2 Corinthians, and then we're going to read Galatians, and then we're going to read Romans. And all three of those letters tie into Paul's journeys in these two verses. Now, these two verses also connect to where we're going tomorrow with Paul's letter of 2 Corinthians, but they do so in a fairly complicated way. And it's because in verse 2, when Paul goes to Greece and visits the city of Corinth, Paul says in 2 Corinthians 13 that this is his third visit to Corinth. Now, the reason that's odd is because Acts 18 records his first visit to Corinth. So if Acts 18 is his first visit to Corinth, Acts 20 and verse 2 is his third visit to Corinth, when in the world was the second visit? The book of Acts doesn't tell us. In 2 Corinthians chapter 2, Paul says that that second visit of his was very sorrowful. It was very painful. It did not go well. Not only that, but in 2 Corinthians 2, verses 3 and 4, he mentions writing to them a sorrowful letter with many tears that was very painful to write. Now, the question is, what letter is he referring to there? Is he referring to 1 Corinthians, which you could see would be very sorrowful? He had to rebuke them for a lot of things. Or was there a separate letter that we don't have anymore that was sorrowful and painful? I used to take the view that it was 1 Corinthians. I'm actually leaning a little bit more toward it being a separate sorrowful letter, though you can't really prove one way or the other. Here's how I think you can reconstruct what happened. If you're just looking at a map, Paul writes 1 Corinthians from the city of Ephesus in 55 AD. He sends that letter to them and says, look, you should expect Timothy to be coming to you shortly, and when Timothy arrives, you need to receive him well. And apparently, probably what happened is they didn't receive Timothy well, and they didn't receive 1 Corinthians well either. And so Timothy brings a report back to Paul and says, look, things didn't go well. They didn't accept me. They didn't accept 1 Corinthians. And that's when Paul makes this second sorrowful visit that Acts doesn't tell us about. He goes over to visit them, and they reject him too, just like they rejected Timothy. And so Paul leaves because he's not welcome there in Corinth. They're totally shutting him down. And then Paul writes a really weighty letter, letter with a super strong rebuke to it. And this is this other letter that we don't have that was painful and that he had tears over because they had rejected him. Their relationship is just totally on the rocks. They're totally not in a right relationship with God. So Paul sends this very painful, sorrowful letter over to them, just rebuking them for their horribly sinful attitudes. And when he does that, Paul is concerned now about his relationship with the Corinthians. Is it over? Right? Are they just going to abandon Paul and abandon the Lord forever at this point? So Paul's in Ephesus, but he's really concerned about the Corinthians. So what he does is, and we learn all of this by using 2 Corinthians chapters 1 through 7 to sort of piece all this together. But since the Corinthians are so much on Paul's mind and heart, while he's in Ephesus, he sends Titus to check on them. And he tells Titus, I want you to check on them, and then I want you to meet me back in Troas, which is a little bit north of Ephesus. I think Paul's plan was, once I leave Ephesus, I'm going to head up north toward Macedonia, and I'll meet you, Titus, in Troas. And you can tell me how the Corinthian brethren are doing. Well, in 2 Corinthians chapter 2, Paul says when he went up to Troas, Titus wasn't there. He didn't find him. And so he was really even more concerned about the Corinthians and what happened to Titus. So he goes on up into Macedonia, and that matches up with Acts chapter 20 and verse 1. When he goes up to Macedonia, that's where he meets Titus, and Titus brings him good news and says, actually, the Corinthians have repented. Most of them had made things right and restored their love and appreciation for you. And so Paul writes 2 Corinthians in response now to the good news that he received from Titus about how they're doing. And now there's still going to be some sinful people in Corinth. There's still going to be some problems, and we'll talk about that tomorrow when we get into the big picture of the letter. But that's the general chronological timeline. And it makes sense as well, because in Acts chapter 20 and verse 1, Paul actually leaves Ephesus sooner than he anticipated. In 1 Corinthians 16, he told them, I don't want to leave Ephesus until Pentecost. But he actually leaves much earlier than Pentecost. Again, I think because he's so concerned about the Corinthians, he's got to leave. He's got to go up to Troas and meet Titus and see how his Corinthian brethren are doing. Again, he didn't find Titus there, but when he goes up to Macedonia, that's where he meets Titus. Titus tells him everything's fine, everything's great with the Corinthians. There's still some problems for sure, though, that he's got to address. But for the most part, they've repented. Your relationship is restored. And that is when Paul writes 2 Corinthians to them, explaining all of that, what was going on in his heart and his concern over them, and then also rebuking some of the sin that's still going on there in Corinth, preparing them. He writes 2 Corinthians, preparing them for his third visit, which takes place in Acts 20 and verse 2. I know that's a whole lot, and it's very complicated, but I tried to make it as clear as possible. If you still have follow-up questions, feel free to ask me anytime. Be happy to elaborate on any of that. And some of that will come back up as we start going through 2 Corinthians and become clearer as we go along. Hope that's helpful. I'll see you tomorrow as we start 2 Corinthians. Today we start 2 Corinthians, which is Paul's most emotional, heartfelt letter that he wrote in the New Testament. And in order to appreciate why that is the case, you got to know that timeline that I gave you yesterday. So I'm going to go over it again today, but keep in mind I'm not doing that just to give you some dry geographical details or to force you to memorize dates for some quiz or test that you got to pass to go to heaven. No, the idea is understanding that timeline will help you appreciate the emotional turmoil that Paul has been going through in his correspondence with the Corinthians. His relationship with the Corinthians is so complicated that really this takes up the greatest real estate of his letters. 1st and 2nd Corinthians takes up the greatest space of all the letters that Paul wrote because this relationship was so complex and so painful at times. So Paul, remember, think timeline-wise. Paul establishes the church in Acts 18 in 51 AD. Now, he spends a year and a half there, and then he goes on to Ephesus for a couple years. But while he's in Ephesus, he hears a terrible report that they're just living horribly wicked lives, and they're dividing the church and all that. And remember, Paul, he considered himself a father to those Christians because he founded that church, and so it's just painful for him to hear that they're not living right. So from Ephesus in AD 55, he sends the letter of 1 Corinthians to them, rebuking them for their sins and teaching them important doctrines and responding to some things that they wrote to him in a letter that they sent him that we don't have. And unfortunately, Paul then hears a report from Timothy that they didn't receive 1 Corinthians well, that they basically rejected his letter. And imagine how painful that would be. So then Paul, from Ephesus, he makes a second visit to Corinth. He goes probably just straight across the sea from Ephesus to Corinth to visit them in person. And then they reject him in person. And it's a sorrowful, painful visit. And so he leaves, goes back over to Ephesus. And after some time passes, he then writes them another letter that we don't have, that would have been very scathing and heavy in its rebuke for their sin, probably calling down God's judgment on them if they don't repent. And it was a letter that Paul said he wrote with tears because it was so painful to write to them. Well, he sends that letter to them, maybe by Titus, not 100% sure about that. But after he sends this letter to them, he's concerned about how they're going to receive it and what it's going to do to their relationship. I mean, if they rejected 1 Corinthians, boy, they might really reject this second letter, which was even more painful and even more strong in its rebuke than 1 Corinthians, and maybe their whole relationship is just going to end, and they're just going to give up on Paul and give up on Jesus and fall away. So Paul is in tremendous distress while he's still over there in Ephesus, wondering how they're going to receive this painful, sorrowful letter that he sent. So Paul sends Titus to go check on them. That's one way to view it. Either Paul actually sent that painful letter with Titus, or later Paul sent Titus to check on them. But the point is, Titus was the one who was supposed to then meet Paul back in Troas and tell Paul whether they received that letter well or not, whether they've repented and made things right and reconciled their relationship with Paul. And so Paul, he can't take it anymore. He has to leave Ephesus early because he wants to find out how the Corinthians are doing. So he travels up north to Troas to meet Titus there. And when he gets there, he doesn't find Titus, and he freaks out about it. So you can see this in 2 Corinthians 2. If you look in verses 12 and 13, he says, 2 Corinthians 2, verse 12, "When I came to Troas for the gospel of Christ, and when a door was opened for me in the Lord, I had no rest for my spirit, not finding Titus my brother. But taking leave of them, I went on to Macedonia." So he goes up north into the west there to Macedonia, and that's when he finally finds Titus. And Titus tells him the good news that the Corinthians have actually repented for the most part of their sins, and they want to reconcile with Paul in their relationship. And so in 2 Corinthians 7, he says verses 6 and 7, "But God, who comforts the depressed, comforted us by the coming of Titus, and not only by his coming, but also by the comfort with which he was comforted in you, as he reported to us your longing, your mourning, your zeal for me, so that I rejoiced even more." And then he mentions, even though I caused you sorrow by my letter, right? He didn't regret it because it ended up producing good fruit. So then Paul's going to write 2 Corinthians from Macedonia, probably in 56 AD, and perhaps send that by the hand of Titus to prepare them for his third visit, when he's finally going to come, and that visit is recorded in Acts chapter 20 and verse 2 that we saw yesterday. So that's the big picture timeline, but you can see, hopefully, that terrible emotional turmoil back and forth where Paul's not sure if his relationship with the Corinthians is going to be over or not. And he's had so many sleepless nights and so much pain and suffering caused by their rejection of him and their rejection of 1 Corinthians, that you can see why this letter is going to be so heartfelt, why he's going to pour out his heart and soul to invite the Corinthians in, to understand his heart for them and what he's been thinking and feeling over all this correspondence between them. So you can divide this letter up into three parts. 1 Corinthians 1 through 7 is basically Paul opening his heart to them, just sharing all the stuff that we've been talking about, all of his turmoil and what's been going on, and with the letter, why he wrote that letter, why he didn't come to them a third time before sending them that letter. He's just explaining all of the feelings and emotions and why he did what he did. And then chapters 8 and 9 is all about the contribution or the collection, because he still plans to come to them and take up that financial collection that he mentioned back in 1 Corinthians 16 to bring to the needy saints in Jerusalem. And then in chapters 10 through 13, Paul defends his apostleship, because while mostly there's good news in the Corinthians church, there's also some bad news, because some false teachers have infiltrated their group. He'll call them false apostles in 2 Corinthians 11. And these might have been like the traveling philosophers who are now passing themselves off as apostles. And they're looking down on Paul. And here's really the theme of this letter. The theme of this letter is Paul defends his apostleship with the principle of power in weakness. I know that's a little bit long. I'll break it down. Paul defends his apostleship with the principle of power in weakness. Here's the problem. These false apostles are basically accusing Paul of not being a legitimate apostle because of how much he suffers. And they start calling into question his character and his legitimacy as an apostle, because look how much he's rejected. Look how hated he is and how persecuted he is all the time. It just seems like bad things continue to happen to Paul, and he's not living the good life at all. Not only that, but he's kind of weak in his appearance and in his presentation of the gospel. He's not a fancy speaker. He's not really powerful in terms of the way we view power in our society. He doesn't take money for his preaching, so maybe he's not really a professional. They're basically taking all of these worldly principles of power and they're saying those are lacking from Paul. Whereas these false apostles, well, they're like super apostles. And they have great rhetoric and powerful speech, and they're preaching about living the good life. And so they're the legitimate ones. And so Paul defends his apostleship by showing how actually the gospel is backwards from the way that this world views power. It goes back to 1 Corinthians chapter 1 when he talked about the reverse nature of the gospel, that the gospel is actually the power of God for salvation to those who believe. Okay, but those who are foolish, it's just weakness, right? It's just folly. And what Paul's doing is internalizing that and saying, you can see the weakness of the gospel playing out in my life as an apostle. And that is what legitimizes my apostleship. Rather than my suffering and my affliction and my human weakness discrediting me, it actually gives me credit because it makes me more like Jesus and it makes my life more in line with the gospel message. And so this is what he's going to hammer all throughout this letter, is that actually when I am weak, then I am strong. He's going to bring that up in chapter 12, that when I'm not relying on my own human power and wisdom, that's when I have true strength. That's what makes me a truly strong apostle, is that I don't rely on myself or my own credentials. I rely on the power of God in my life. We're going to see that now in today's reading, verses 1 through 11. Obviously, because of that long intro, I don't have much time. But you see this as Paul emphasizes God's power to comfort us in our suffering. Suffering does look weak from a human perspective. And the false apostles and some of the Corinthians would have been criticizing Paul for his suffering. But Paul says when you trust in God, God will flip that weakness on its head and use it as a source of strength. He calls him the God of all comfort, which implies not just the soothing of our pain, but a strengthening to face that pain, a boldness, a courage to continue pressing on despite our suffering. And when you look at suffering from a human perspective, it doesn't really seem like there's anything beneficial about it at all. But Paul says there's 4 benefits to the suffering that he's experiencing and the power that God brings from it. Number 1, he says, it creates empathy within me so that when I suffer and God comforts me, I know what it's like for other people to be suffering, and I can comfort them with the same comfort with which I've been comforted. Secondly, he says, my suffering leads to the salvation of souls. Just like God used Jesus' suffering to bring about salvation to the world, God is using Paul's suffering as an apostle, a preacher of the gospel, to spread the gospel and to bring about the salvation of the Corinthian souls and the souls of those in Asia and Macedonia and everywhere else that Paul traveled. Number 3, it creates solidarity with Jesus, because the more Paul suffers for Jesus, the more he feels connected with Christ, to know what Jesus himself went through, suffering for righteousness' sake. He's walking in the footsteps of his Lord, and that improves and draws them closer in their relationship. And then it also provides solidarity between brethren. Because if your brethren are suffering also for the sake of Christ, it makes you feel not so alone in this fight. You know you have fellow soldiers in the church who are in this battle together, that Satan is also attacking from multiple angles, and Paul is inviting the Corinthians to suffer with him, to be willing to suffer like Christ did so that they can comfort each other and experience the comfort of God together. Now, he mentions this time in Asia where he was burdened beyond his strength. He was filled with despair because he was about to die, and there was nothing he could do to get himself out of the situation, it didn't seem. And we don't know exactly what situation he's talking about here, but this is going to be a common theme all throughout this letter, that Paul is just constantly on the brink of death as an apostle. And the false apostles would use that to discredit Paul. But Paul says, actually, that was my strength, because the fact that I was burdened beyond my strength meant I couldn't rely on myself. Instead, I had to rely on God to deliver me. And he did. God came through for me. He delivered me. He is a God of deliverance, and he will continue to deliver me from perils in this life, but ultimately from death in the end, right, in the resurrection. And he invites the Corinthians to pray for him at the end. And what's interesting is usually Paul in his letters, he starts with a thanksgiving section, giving thanks for his brethren. He doesn't really do that here, probably because there's still some problems going on and they've caused him a lot of issues. But what he's trying to do is get them to give thanks to God for him, because they're holding his character and credibility as an apostle in suspicion. And so he's really trying to bridge this gap in their relationship to get them to realize, I want you to thank God for the sufferings that I'm going through, because those sufferings are for your benefit and for the benefit of the whole world by bringing the gospel to them. And just a quick application as we close, sometimes we say God doesn't give us more than we can handle. That's not true. Paul says this was too much for him to handle. He was burdened beyond his strength. And God does that. He puts us in these situations so that we will recognize in humility the limits of our strength and realize we are frail, we are weak, and we can't deliver ourselves. We need his power. We need to turn to him. That's what this letter is going to be all about. Finding power in weakness by turning to God when things are too much for us to handle. That really defined Paul's apostleship, and he's going to use that principle, power in weakness, to defend his apostleship to his brethren that are doubting it at this time. I'll see you tomorrow.